Hello and welcome back to Matt's Automotive channel. In this video we're going to be installing a new clutch again into the GT500. We recently put a new clutch into the GT500 because the original one had failed. This is an Exedy Stage 4 clutch and it has only been about 8 or 9 months and I've already removed it. And that's because I had two problems, one of which was my own fault and then the other has to do more with just the clutch itself. Anyway, the two problems that I was having was, first of all, noise and vibration around 1500 RPM with this Exedy clutch. And it was a very narrow band. It was only between 1500 and 1700. So about for 200 RPM, it would make this, this rattle noise and it would shake the car. You could actually feel it in the floorboard. You could also feel it in the shifter. And it wasn't too bad, really. It was something that I could live with. And I figured, well, okay, I'll just keep the RPMs up a little higher, and so when I shift, it doesn't drop below the 1500, and also start out with a little higher RPM, and anyway, mitigate that issue. But then it wasn't much longer that I had problem number two. Now, this is the problem that I had caused by incorrectly installing this clutch. And the problem that I was having was lockout. And I don't mean high-speed lockout like what you would get in the MT82 transmission when you're trying to shift at high RPMs and racing, that sort of thing. I'm talking about complete lockout. In other words, I would start up the car and I couldn't put it in gear, or if I started up in gear, I couldn't get it out of gear. Sometimes I would come up to a stop and the light's going to be long, so I'd put it in neutral. And then when I was ready to take off, try to put it back into first, no, couldn't do it. The only way that I could get it back into gear was to shut the motor off, put it into the gear I wanted, start it in that gear, and then take off, and then it would work fine. Now, this lockout only happened about 4 or 5 times over the last 8 or 9 months, so it didn't happen frequently, but it would happen. And that's kind of what pushed me over the edge to just go ahead and get another clutch, the combination of those two problems. At first I thought, oh, it must be a defective clutch or something. But then when I pulled it apart, I noticed something. And can you guess what I may have done wrong that would cause that? Let me show you. Okay, so I'll zoom in here and see if you can figure out what I did wrong. Okay, that's hint number 1. And here's hint number 2. Kind of difficult to see these splines here, but anyway, they're completely dry. I've never forgot to do this before, but I did. I went back and looked at the video that I'd made and put on YouTube, and sure enough, I did forget to lubricate these splines. I did lubricate the pilot bearing. This input shaft here goes into the pilot bearing in this area, and that was all greased up. Of course, the new pilot bearing comes with grease as well. But in the video, I did see myself lubing this up a little bit more, but for some reason, I just totally forgot this. So anyway, that's the problem. Now, these clutches, they're for the GT500 or twin disc, and they seem to be a little bit more susceptible and finicky to that sort of thing. Had I put just a single disc in, of course I would have had a much heavier clutch pedal. It'd be like driving a truck. I'd done that in one of my previous rigs, and I swore I'd never do that again. So I went for the twin disc, and that's also what the OEM clutch is as well. But there's more parts. I mean, you got 2 of these discs. One of them here. This one here is still in the pressure plate assembly, but as you can see, there's another spline right there. So, and then there's a floater plate in between. So anyway, there's a lot of things moving around on that input shaft, and so it's more susceptible to binding and that sort of thing. And I believe that's what happened. I can't say for 100% certain, but I'm like 99% certain that when I put the clutch in, it wouldn't fully release because the clutches and the floater plate were binding up, keeping it kind of in gear a little bit. So the next one, I'm definitely going to remember to do that. I will never forget to do that again. Now, the type of grease that you put on there is also pretty important. There's 3 things that you really need to be careful with, and there's 3 ways to screw it up. One of which is putting the wrong kind of grease on the splines. You definitely want to use something that's designed for high heat. Reason being, if you just put a regular type grease on, as this thing heats up and it's spinning around, that grease is going to get very thin, and then it's going to spin off and guess where it's going to get? Guess where it's going to end up? It's going to come from these splines and then come out here and get on your friction material, and that's going to screw your clutch up. So you definitely want to use a high heat grease to eliminate that problem. Let's see, of course, okay, that's number one. Of course, number two is what I did. Don't put any on at all. Number three, you can put too much on, even if you have the correct grease to put on. If you put too much on, you can still have some of that oozing out and getting onto the friction material. So anyway, be real careful. It's a very important step. Okay, so anyway, the vibration issue. Can you guess why I had the vibration in this thing? If you look at this, this clutch here, it may be obvious to you. Maybe not. Let me compare it to the one I just bought. Okay, here's the new one, and here's the old one. The difference is this has a sprung hub. You can tell by the springs here. This one does not. And of course, these are twin discs, so there's two of these in each clutch pack here. So this one, this is the Exedy Stage 4, doesn't have a sprung hub on either disc. This one here does. So anyway, the whole purpose of these springs here is to reduce shock going into the transmission. It'll smooth things out, and it's not so harsh on the transmission. I'll bet the transmission even lasts a little longer with something like a sprung hub, and also the shifting should be a little bit smoother as well. And also, this should eliminate that noise, because basically any vibration that's in the motor was transferring directly into this, and it was vibrating, making noise. So this should eliminate that issue. So anyway, when I chose a new clutch, I kind of went to the opposite end of the spectrum as my first one. The first one that I got, the Exedy Stage 4, I bought because it was one of the lower priced ones. Any of the clutches that go into the GT500 tend to be a little expensive, probably because they need to handle all that horsepower. This particular car is a 2010 GT500 and came stock with 550 horsepower. I've done a couple of mild mods to it. I've increased the boost by going to a smaller pulley, cold air intake, and also a tune. So I'm probably in somewhere in the neighborhood of around 600 to 650 horsepower. And that's a lot of horsepower for a clutch to endure. Okay, so anyway, yeah, I went fairly cheap on this one. And this is an Exedy, and there's nothing really bad to say about Exedy. This type of clutch with an unsprung hub is probably great for racing. In fact, it did have a very positive connected type feel, which I liked, with the exception of the noise and vibration associated with that clutch. So still a very good clutch, and if you're tracking your car, that may be what you want. But if you have putting a clutch on a daily driver, you're probably going to want to go with the sprung hub. So anyway, the clutch I just purchased is a Mantic clutch. It's an Australian company that makes high quality clutches. And so I kind of went from one of the cheaper to one of the more expensive type. So anyway, let me show you a little bit more about this Mantic clutch. It's a little different than the other one. All right, first of all, this Exedy clutch. And by the way, look at the burn marks in here. That was only basically 2 trips to the drag strip and a daily driving for about 8-9 months. And also here on the pressure plate, same thing. This one here came like this. You install this disc, and there's also another friction disc in here in the pressure plate, and it came like this, assembled, and instructions recommended not taking this apart. Everything's torqued and set properly as is, so it was just assembled like this. And I didn't mess with any of that. So, wow, look at that rust in there. It's just, there was just no lube. Anyway, here's the Mantic clutch, and it actually comes in a nice case here. You can tell this is definitely upper end, and they take pride in their product. And this is what you get here. This one is, of course, for the GT500, so it has the has a new slave cylinder here, and along with it comes this little backing plate here. This ends up going behind this, and of course that would go right in here to push this slave cylinder out a little bit more. This clutch is a lot thinner than the OEM one. In fact, this one is a lot thinner than the OEM one, and by about 1.25 inches. And when I'm kind of getting off track here, but when you pull out the OEM clutch on this, it's very difficult to get the transmission out because the clutch is so thick. Let's see. It comes back out here another 1.25 inches, which means that you have to pull the transmission back another 1.25 inches before you can drop the thing. And of course, the transmission hits the body here, and it's very difficult to get out. So you end up having to clock this thing 45 degrees to get the little bulge where the starter is down below this area. And you end up also having to remove the rear bolts here for the K-member, and also loosen these guys up here on the front so the whole K-member tilts back. You also have to jack up the front of the motor here a little bit to get even a little more additional tilt on the motor mounts, just to get that thing out. Now, because this other clutch is so much thinner, you don't have these issues. In fact, when I took this one out, I didn't have to do any of that. It came out like a normal clutch. So anyway, getting back here on topic, here's the Mantic clutch. And this one comes fully disassembled, unlike the Exedy. The pressure plate here, totally separate. And of course the flywheel, that's separate as well. And then you get the floater plate that goes in between the two clutches. And here's the other clutch. And, oh, there's the floater plate right there. And as you can see, the other clutch is also sprung as well. And so basically you assemble this on the car. Well, I'll go through that procedure anyway, so I won't have to explain it too much right here. But anyway, that's basically what you get with this Mantic clutch. All right, so in this video, I'm not going to go through all the details of pulling the clutch and what's involved with that and going through all the steps. If you're interested in that, just view my previous video pulling it out. And of course, that was with the OEM clutch. So being an extra thick clutch, it's very difficult to get out. So you can see the procedure for that. And of course, this aftermarket one and the Mantic should go in much easier, like a regular clutch. And so I'm not going to go through any of that process either. I'm just basically going to focus on the assembly of this Mantic clutch. So yeah, again, if you're interested in seeing all the details, view the other video. The only thing that's not included in that video is the greasing of the splines. So keep that in mind. Very, very important. So anyway, now you know where I'm coming from and where I'm going. So let's go ahead and get started on the installation of this clutch. All right, now that we have everything all laid out here, let's go ahead and get started with the assembly of the clutch. First thing we want to do is clean up this flywheel. Of course, all the metal parts are shipped with oil on them so they don't rust during shipment. So use either brake clean or lacquer or something that's going to dissolve the oil and not leave a residue. So we'll set that aside. Probably the very next thing we should do is, before we go any further, make sure that we have the proper clutch here, and make sure that we have the same number of splines here that's on the input shaft of our transmission. So let's go check that out right now. Okay, so here's the input shaft of our transmission. Here's one of the clutch discs. And we just need to make sure that this moves nice and smooth over the splines. And they do. All right, the first thing we have laid out here is our cover. And we got the 8 bolts that are going to go onto this cover here. We also have nuts here, and we're not going to use these for this particular application. I'm surprised they even shipped them with this kit, but we're not going to need those. And we also got some new flywheel bolts here. Looks like these are a 12-point bolt. And also, along with these bolts here, come these little washers. Make sure that these go onto all the bolts here before you install them onto this cover. So let's go ahead and get these started here. Okay, try to hold these in place and flip it over here. And get that last one in. Right there. Okay, now that we got all the bolts in along with the washers, let's go ahead and put our pressure plate on. So like so. Okay, next we can go ahead and put in our turn blocks here. Now these should also be cleaned too. On these blocks, these plates are going to be sliding up and down a little bit on them, so you definitely want to make sure that these are clean. So clean each of these up before you put them in. Almost forgot on this pressure plate here, we need to clean that up first before we put it on. Let's get the oil off of that. Okay. Now we'll go ahead and lay this in. Okay, next is going to be one of the clutch discs. Now, if you look at this, pay close attention. It does say here on this particular one, pressure plate side. So here's the pressure plate. So this will go face down on here. And the reason it matters is one side here protrudes a little more than the other, and you don't want the two discs to conflict with one another. Okay, now the floater plate will be next. And on this floater plate, it comes shipped with these little styrofoam pieces in these little springs here, so make sure that you get all those out first. Okay, and once you get all those parts out, clean both sides of this plate, because friction material rubs against both sides. This is the floater plate. It's in between the two clutch discs. So very important that both sides of this be clean. Okay, and we can go ahead and lay this in. Okay, and then we'll follow it up with the last clutch disc here. Now this one here, again, it's labeled, this is the flywheel side. So that's going to be facing up because the flywheel will be like so when we put the thing on. So that goes up like so. All right, now we're ready to go ahead and install the flywheel onto the motor using the newly supplied bolts here. Okay, before I go ahead and get under the car, I'm just going to go ahead and apply some of the Loctite to these bolts right now. Okay, so let's go ahead and get under the car and install the flywheel. Okay, one thing to note before putting the flywheel on is these bolts are not all symmetrical. A couple of these holes are closer together than the rest of them, so that means that the flywheel has to be clocked in a particular way. And if you look real close, you can tell that these two holes here are closer together than any other two holes. So look for that same setup on the flywheel. It looks like right here. And light it up and then kind of push it on. And then whatever you do, don't let go of the flywheel until you got one of these bolts here threaded in pretty good. Okay, and these are going to get torqued down to 59 pound-feet. Okay, these flywheel bolts that came with the clutch are a 5/8 inch socket with a 12 point. All right, now to keep the flywheel from turning while I torque these bolts down, I put one of these ratchet extensions in here, kind of wedged in between the flywheel and the engine block, so that should hold it in place while we torque these down. And when you do these, you want to do them in a crisscross pattern. Okay, and then we'll just go once around, make sure that we got them all on there. And that's looking pretty good. And we'll wipe this down once again because we did touch it with some dirty hands just to make sure that it's really clean before we put the clutch on. Okay, now before we go any further, want to make sure I don't do the same mistake I did last time, which was forget to lubricate the splines. So I'm going to pull this apart a little bit, just enough to lubricate these splines. And I'm going to use caliper grease. This is for brakes, and this is a high heat grease that should not thin out too much when it gets hot. And go ahead and put some on here. And the same thing with the other disc. Okay, so I'll put some grease on here. And then we'll take this over to the transmission and slide this back and forth on the input shaft and then wipe off any excess. Okay, so this is of course the step that I forgot last time I did this job, which created the lockout condition I had. And so we'll put some on here now. Also put a little bit on the end of the input shaft here. This part is what goes into the pilot bearing. And the other thing is, this is a brand new slave cylinder. Just went in when I did the last clutch, which was about 8 or 9 months ago. So I'm going to try to reuse this. We will have to take measurements to make sure that it will work as is. We may end up having to put the backing plate on there, but we'll check that out. Okay, now very important, when you're handling these discs with your greasy fingers, make sure that you don't get anything on the friction material. Be very careful of that. So, in fact, I'm going to set this down. We'll do one at a time. We'll put it on here, and then move it back and forth to spread that grease, and then we'll turn it a little bit, like so. Do it again, and just make sure that the grease ends up on all the splines and all the way around. Okay, and then of course you want to wipe off any of the excess here. I mean, the grease out here isn't going to do you any good, and eventually what's going to happen is this spins, the grease is going to work its way down here onto the friction material, which would be very bad. So be very careful that you wipe off any excess. Okay, after sliding both these discs on the input shaft, it's very obvious that we have some excess here. So definitely we need to get that off. And on both sides. And also on both discs. Here's the other one, and it has a bunch of excess here as well. Okay. This time we shouldn't get any lockout. Now we can go back over to the bench and then reassemble these discs. Okay, so again, make sure that you have the right disc. This one here says pressure plate side on this, so that goes down. Okay, then the floater plate, and then the flywheel disc. Okay, flywheel side is going to be up, like so. Okay, now we can take this whole assembly over and bolt it onto the flywheel. All right, of course, keeping all this together while we haul it over is going to be a little bit challenging. So I'm putting a little bit of tape on each side to kind of hold this assembly together while I'm carrying it over. And I'm also going to put some tape on some of these bolts here on the back side, except maybe one of them. So I can kind of get it up into place and get the one bolted in. I just don't want any of this stuff falling onto the ground as I try to assemble it. If you have a second person, definitely utilize that person. Okay, you see I got it all taped up. I don't have the tape coming completely around onto the flywheel side, or actually the disc here, because I don't want tape to get sandwiched in there as I bolt this up. So make sure that you'll be able to get it all off once you install it. So anyway, that should hold it together enough for me to at least get it started. And I left this one untaped, so that's the one that I'm going to start. Okay, so here we go. I'm gonna go over and get the clutch immediately.
Okay, kind of got it in place there.
Okay, now get all the tape off, and we can start tightening these bolts down now. Ultimately, these are going to get torqued to 25 pound-feet, but we want to do it very slowly, crisscross pattern, and little by little. We don't want to torque any one side, any bolt down at once. Just do it little by little, so everything goes on nice and square. And constantly check your alignment tool. Make sure it continues to slide in and out nice. And these fingers will retract and go inward as we tighten this down. And you can kind of tell if you're tightening one side a little more than the other just by looking at these fingers here. If you tighten this one too much, these fingers will retract more than the others. So just keep an eye on that as you go around. You can see they're starting to go in now. And the discs no longer freely move around in there. So that's good. Got them all snug down to where there's pretty good resistance. So at this point we can go ahead and torque them. Input or alignment tool still goes in and out real nice and smooth. And you can also see that these fingers, let's see if I get an angle here at the side, they've retracted quite a bit. These fingers were out probably flush with this flat spot here on the clutch. So definitely in there a lot. And the next thing we're going to do is have to measure that distance from the flat to these fingers here. All right, so let's go ahead and torque them up to 25 pound-feet. 25 pound-feet is not a whole lot, so we don't really need to hold anything in place. All right, now we can go ahead and pull the alignment tool out. Make sure it still goes in all the way. Nice and easy, no problem there. You know, that clutch is so pretty, it's too bad we have to cover it all up. Okay, the next step is to take measurements to determine how much compression that we're going to have on our slave cylinder. This is probably one of the most important steps of the whole process. What we're looking for is values between 0.5 inches and 0.625 inches. So, how are we going to do that? Well, let's take some measurements and I'll show you. Okay, first of all, our slave cylinder is going to make contact with these fingers here. So what we really need to know is when we mate the transmission with the engine, how much is these fingers here going to push in on that slave cylinder? And again, we want 0.5 inches to 0.625 inches. So in order to do that, we're going to take some measurements. Now, the measurement that we really need is the distance from these fingers to the engine block, including the little spacer here. That does have some thickness. So the way to do it is to measure from this flat edge to the fingers, and then from the flat edge to the engine block, and then subtract that difference. So basically that's the distance that these fingers here are going to intrude on the transmission when you mate the two together. All right, so the tools we're going to use are some calipers here with a plunger depth gauge, which is used right here on the end, and then also a straight edge. And why I say we measure from this flat surface here is because that's really the only place that we can get the flat edge on here to make measurements. So we're going to use this, measure from here to the block, and then from here to the fingers, subtract those differences, and that's really the distance between these fingers and the engine block. So we'll lay that flat across there, and then take our measurements. Okay, now also the thing to note here is this flat edge here, of course, has some thickness. I've already measured it. This is 0.035 inches, so we'll have to subtract that thickness from all our measurements. Okay, the only measurement that we need to take on the transmission side is from this edge here to the edge of the slave cylinder. So let's go ahead and expand our caliper here. Place this across the edge. And then poke it through the hole here. And then take this measurement. Just like so. All right, so I've taken all our measurements here. And basically these are the two equations that we're going to use is the A minus B, which is A is the distance from the engine to that flat edge, and then B is the distance from that flat edge to the fingers of the clutch. Subtract those differences, and then you're going to get D. Okay, and then the other measurement was C. So we're basically measuring, this is on the transmission side now, measuring distance from the edge here where it meets up with the motor to where the slave cylinder is, and that's our measurement for C. So we take A minus B, and then we get D. So that measurement is 3.3 minus 0.0373. We get a distance of 2.927. That's the distance from the edge of this engine to the fingers. Okay, then I also measured on the transmission side from the edge of the transmission to the slave cylinder. That turned out to be 2.309. Okay, so then we're going to use this formula here, D minus C, and that's going to be the compression. So when we make these together, this clutch here is going to push in on the slave cylinder that amount. And again, we want that to be between 0.5 and 0.625 inches. So we take those two measurements, subtract them, and the D minus C, and we get 0.618. So that falls right into the range that we need. So we're good to go as is. All right, so took the measurements. I used the old slave cylinder. I didn't move it, didn't take it out or anything, so we're definitely going to be able to reuse that. Now remember, if you're pulling the OEM clutch, this one's going to be much, much shorter, and you will need to use the slave cylinder that's supplied with the kit. And also remember, the kit has the that spacer, so if you don't fall within this range, you can always put in the spacer. So anyway, I'm going to start buttoning this back up. Again, I'm going to skip the process of putting the transmission back in. If you want to see that, that's in the previous video when I originally swapped out the OEM clutch. So anyway, I'll get this back together, and then we'll go ahead and take it for a test drive and see how it works. Okay, I got the transmission back in the car without issue. I did start it up here in the garage and then put it in gear and see if I could inch it back and forth, and I was able to do that. However, what I noticed was getting it into gear was a little more difficult than it was with the previous clutch. So I ended up raising the car back up on the lift and started it up, put it in gear, and put the clutch in and observed the rear wheels. And I noticed that they slowed down significantly, but they didn't stop. So that tells me there's still a little bit of drag on the clutch, and something's going on there. This video, however, is getting a little long, so I'll go ahead and resume this on the next video. And I would take it out for a test drive right now, but our weather is pretty bad. We got about 7 inches of snow right now. It's continuing to snow. So I'm gonna have to wait till this clears up to really give this a thorough test. But I will continue in the next video, and we'll take a look at that issue that we're having with the clutch. All right, so once this weather clears up, we'll go ahead and take this out on the road and test out this clutch a little more in depth, and then also address the issue of the clutch dragging a little bit. So anyway, I'll catch you on the next one. Have a great day. Bye.